Hello. I hope the framing is right and you can see me and the whiteboard. Today's lecture is going to be about aging. First, what I'm going to do is to get you motivated. So why should we talk about aging? Well, it affects each and every one of us. It is inevitable. And it has all those nasty symptoms, which include wrinkles, being prone to diseases, reduced mental capacities and physical capacities, memory loss, gray hair, decreased libido even, okay? And so nobody likes that. And it would be great to know what we can do to conquer aging and to live longer, right? Well, in order to answer this question, we have to gain a little more and deeper understanding of what aging is. Basically, as we go through our lives, the cells in our organism accumulate damage. Basically, all systems within our cells become more and more damaged as we get older, and this is essentially what aging is, right? This is the essence of aging. But from a more scientific point of view, the aging has 9 manifestations, which are called the 9 hallmarks of aging. Well, we'll go through each of them. Some of them we'll discuss in more detail than the other ones, the other points, but this is just an overview of those hallmarks, just to give you a little bit of understanding of what aging is and what can we do about it. So the first hallmark is genomic instability. Well, as you know from school biology, our organisms are composed of cells, and each cell, well, technically not each cell, but the majority of cells have the nucleus as their core, and within that nucleus, our genetic material is stored in the form of DNA. Well, around the nucleus is embedded in the cytoplasm, which also includes all the different organelles which we have in our cells, all the different molecules such as proteins which perform different functions, structural, catalytic, lipids, and other molecules. So genomic instability. The DNA in our nucleus, all the DNA in our nucleus is called our genome, which we have inherited from our parents. The genome is basically DNA, molecules of DNA, and this DNA has the capacity, has a coding capacity. Parts of our DNA that code for proteins are called genes. These are the most important parts of our genomes, because proteins have all those different functions that are vital for survival, for our ability to live, right? But those genes actually occupy only not more than 5% of our whole genome, and the other 95% are occupied by so-called introns, which have no function, but we benefit from having those introns very much, and we will arrive to this shortly. What is genomic instability? Genomic instability is essentially the fact that our DNA gets damaged over time, As we get through our lives, we expose ourselves constantly to various mutagens, which include smoking, excessive UV light, alcohol, junk food, and what is a mutagen, you might say? A mutagen is a substance or a physical phenomenon or something just happens around us that can change our DNA. All right, it affects it adversely, causing little changes in the DNA code, which are called mutations. Okay, and so the DNA damage is basically mutations that happen within the genes. All right, but because our genome is mostly introns, the majority of those mutations don't affect us at all. And this is the benefit of having those introns. But when those mutations arrive in our genes, this is pretty harmful. Well, some parts of our genes are not that important as other parts. And so if a mutation arrives in a gene, we will be able to live in the part of the gene with the mutation is not very important, but if it is important, it may affect our health adversely, and we may even die because of a mutation. So if the mutation happened to be in a gene which acts in a repair pathway, or which product is essential for cellular repair, or repair of cellular damage, DNA damage causes aging. So yeah, all those mutagens, they damage our DNA, they affect the genes implicated in repair pathways, and because our cells become less able to control the damage to their cellular machinery, we become older and the damage accumulates. And the second point is telomere attrition. Well, our DNA is actually composed of double-stranded helical DNA molecules, and at the end of those molecules, there are small parts called telomeres. Now I'm going to tell you about their function. Well, when our cells divide, well, before the actual division of cells, our DNA must be replicated. And during the DNA replication, it actually becomes a little bit shortened from the sides, from its ends, right? And if there were no telomeres, this would result in loss of genes, maybe essential genes, and we would not benefit from it at all. And so the telomeres safeguard our DNA molecules from becoming shortened, but they become shortened themselves. But the cell has special special enzyme called telomerase, which is able to lengthen the telomeres to restore their original length. And as we age, the telomerase production becomes less and less efficient. We have less and less telomerase in our cells, and our telomeres become shorter and shorter and shorter. Okay? And at the end, their length becomes 0, and our DNA starts, DNA damage starts, loss of genes starts, and all the other harmful consequences. So the third hallmark of aging is epigenetic alterations. Well, this thing is actually quite complex, and we won't go into much details here. All you should know is that our DNA molecules are actually not the only species in our nucleus. Our nucleus also has proteins, which are arranged in those bodies called nucleosomes and around which DNA is wrapped. Okay? Their function is this, just structural and regulatory too. So these proteins can be chemically modified or labeled with just small chemical groups. Okay? And as we age, the pattern of this chemical labeling changes, and it may affect our DNA in the way that the genes responsible for reparation become less accessible, and reparation slows down, and the damage is not repaired, and we age. Why do they become less accessible? Because the DNA wrapped around those nucleosomes, they're called, just becomes more condensed as the nucleosome labeling pattern changes. The fourth hallmark is loss of proteostasis. You may wonder what the heck does it mean, right? Proteostasis. As proteins are synthesized in our bodies, in our cells, they must be folded correctly in order to function as they should do. But sometimes they become misfolded. Their folding is mediated by proteins called chaperones, but chaperones are not perfect. They make mistakes, and sometimes they release misfolded proteins into the cytoplasm. And there, those misfolded proteins tend to aggregate, and this results in harmful consequences for the cells. And so this is another hallmark of aging because of that. The fifth hallmark is the regulated nutrient sensing. And here, this hallmark is exemplified really well by a protein called mTOR. So mTOR is a small protein which is involved in a rich repertoire of regulatory pathways, and its activity is increased when there are a lot of nutrients around. But one of its activities is inhibition of a process called autophagy. Well, some of you may guess what it means. It means eating yourself, basically. Well, this is a process which cells use to eliminate defective cellular structures. They just eat them inside themselves using autophagy. But when the nutrients are abundant, mTOR activity is increased and the autophagy is inhibited by mTOR. And so damaged structures accumulate in the cells, and this results in aging. The sixth point is mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondria are organelles that produce energy in our body using oxygen and other molecules which they oxidize with this oxygen, and all this energy production is accompanied by electron leaks from the mitochondria. And those electron leaks produce ROS, or reactive oxygen species, in our cells, which in moderation are actually beneficial because they mediate cellular signaling processes. But when they are formed in excess, and they are formed in excess when mitochondria start dysfunctioning, the ROS, reactive oxygen species, can cause damage to the cells, and so this damage accumulates and we age. Cellular senescence. Well, there was a scientist called Hayflick who discovered that our cells cannot divide for an infinite amount of times. But they can divide a finite amount of times. Senescence is basically when they stop dividing. Well, the major factor that causes this senescence is telomere attrition, which we have already talked about. Well, actually, cellular senescence is a mechanism of protection from cancer. Well, as the cells, as individual cells age, more and more mutations accumulate in their genomes, and this increases the probability of them becoming cancerous. So this stop in division is actually a mechanism that prevents the cells from becoming cancerous. But when too many cells are become senescent, the body starts requiring replacing those cells with new ones. All right? And this leads us to the next hallmark, stem cell exhaustion. Well, stem cells are progenitor cells which can generate new cells in our body. And when many cells become senescent, in order to replace them with new healthy cells, stem cells must divide a lot of times, which results in their exhaustion. And stem cell division is the major mechanism in our body maintenance, right? If some cells are defective, if some damage has accumulated in any of those cells, stem cells can just divide, produce new cells, and we're good. But when they are exhausted, their capability of dividing is diminished, and this is another hallmark, right? We start aging because of that. And the ninth hallmark, the last one, is actually the most complex of all, altered intercellular communication. We won't go into detail here as well, but all you should know is that it has to do with inflammation. Well, as we age, intercellular communication becomes deregulated, especially the communication between the cells in our body and the immune cells. And this results in excessive inflammation, which causes our immune system to become worn out. But without our immune system, we are prone to all diseases, and this is definitely not good for the body. So this is why altered intercellular communication is the ninth hallmark of aging. Okay? Well, you might wonder, okay, so why should I know all that? Well, now you understand basically how aging works, and so the question is, what can we do about it? What can we reverse all those aging processes, or at least slow them down? Well, for each of those hallmarks, there is a method to reverse it or to ameliorate its effects. Let's go through the whole list. Well, genomic instability. We can just locate the cells with mutations and eliminate them, right? In theory. Second one, telomere attrition. We can stimulate the production of telomerase and lengthen our telomeres. The third, epigenetic alterations. Well, there are drugs that reverse those alterations. We can use them. Loss of proteostasis. We can activate our chaperones, stimulate their production, and decrease the amount of misfolded proteins. Then mitochondrial, no, deregulated nutrient sensing. Well, caloric restriction is the solution for this one. The sixth hallmark, mitochondrial dysfunction. Yeah, why caloric restriction, you might wonder. The less calories we consume, the less our mTOR is active, the less our autophagy is inhibited, and the healthier our cells are. The sixth one, mitochondrial dysfunction. Well, there is a thing called mitohermetics, which proved to be useful in this aspect. What it is when we basically treat our cells with mild toxins that affect mitochondria. They cause just a little bit of damage there. Then mitochondria start repairing themselves, and as they repair themselves, they surpass the pre-damage state and become even more healthy, which is quite good for treating mitochondrial dysfunction. Seventh, cellular senescence. As with the first point, we can just locate those senescent cells and eliminate them, right? The eighth point, stem cell exhaustion. Well, there are certain stem cell-based therapies, but they're quite complex, and we won't go into detail here as well. As for the ninth, altered intercellular communication, we can just use anti-inflammatory drugs for this one. But why doesn't everyone use those methods to prolong his or her life? A nice question. Well, because all these hallmarks and all the treatments that I've just mentioned have been proven to work only in laboratory animals, which include yeast, Caenorhabditis elegans, which is a small and tiny roundworm, which is about 1 millimeter long and very thin. You can barely see it with a naked eye. And in some cases, mice, okay? But in an organism as complex as human being, it is very difficult to analyze all these 9 processes and develop treatments for each of them. Also, we don't understand very clearly how all these processes are interconnected, so a lot of research has to be done here in order to start developing therapies for humans. But the therapy that I've just mentioned, they work for those simple laboratory animals. For example, scientists have already managed to increase the yeast's lifespan tenfold. Well, this is the maximum amount they've managed to accomplish, but the maximum increase. But probably in the future they will accomplish more. And now the most important part of the lecture. What can we actually do to prolong our lives? To increase our health span, right? The healthy part of the lifespan. Well, we can acquire this information by talking to people called centenarians and supercentenarians. Those are basically people who lived more than 100 years and more than 110 years, respectively. Well, from centenarians and supercentenarians interviews, it was discovered that the majority of them had regular mental and physical activity, right? They were keeping themselves in shape. They had Mediterranean diet, which is basically fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and nuts. Not that fried meat that we like so much. The majority of them tend to sleep 6 to 7 hours, which is quite exciting because usually they say that one should sleep 8 hours a night. Also, according to the studies with centenarians and supercentenarians, one should avoid excessive stress because stress also affects, also promotes aging processes. Well, as we talked about it earlier, you should avoid excessive UV light, smoking. Avoid smoking at all costs because this is the most potent mutagen of all. Avoid alcohol, avoid junk food, avoid breathing in, inhaling toxic fumes, and so on, other mutagens. And also, the last thing, be optimistic. There actually were studies that proved that all those centenarians and supercentenarians were optimistic about their age, and they